The blizzard should have killed him. Instead, it brought her. When Wyoming rancher Elias Porter opened his cabin door on Christmas Eve 1887, he expected death, not a woman emerging from the storm like an answered prayer he'd stopped believing in. Clara Whitlock, his mail-order bride, had walked 5 miles through a killer blizzard to reach a man she'd never met. But she carried more than just a wedding contract. She carried a secret gift that would either save his dying ranch or reveal the devastating truth about why she'd really come west. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind howled like something alive and hungry, clawing at the wooden walls of the cabin with fingers made of ice and fury. Elias Porter sat hunched before the dying fire, watching the last of his hope flicker in the orange glow of embers that couldn't seem to hold their heat. Outside, the Wyoming darkness pressed against the frost-covered windows, and somewhere in that endless white hell, his cattle were freezing to death. He knew it, could feel it in his bones the way a man feels his own mortality creeping closer with each passing winter. 37 head left, he muttered to the empty room, his voice rough from disuse. Maybe less by morning. The cabin answered with silence, the kind that settles into a place when hope has packed its bags and quietly slipped out the door. Elias rubbed his calloused hands together, then reached for the whiskey bottle on the table beside him. His fingers stopped just short of the glass neck. He'd been reaching for that bottle too often lately, trying to drown the voice in his head that whispered the same message every night. You failed. This place is dying, and it's taking you with it. 3 years ago, the Porter Ranch had been something to be proud of. 200 head of cattle, strong fences, a barn that didn't leak when it rained. His father had built this place from nothing, carved it out of the wilderness with his bare hands and an unshakable faith that God provided for those who worked hard and kept their word. Elias had believed that once, had stood beside his father in the fields and felt certain that faith and hard work were enough to weather any storm. Then his father died. Then the drought came. Then the bank loans came due, and the cattle prices dropped, and suddenly faith felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. He stood abruptly, turning his back on the whiskey, and moved to the window. Through the frost patterns etched into the glass, he could barely make out the shape of the barn, a dark silhouette against the swirling white of the blizzard. The storm had hit just after sunset, roaring down from the mountains with a violence that made even the old-timers in Sweetwater Valley shake their heads and mutter prayers. Worst Christmas Eve storm in 20 years, old Joe McKenzie had said that morning at the general store. Animals caught out in this won't-see morning. Elias pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He'd done what he could, moved as many cattle as possible into the barn and the 3 shelter sheds he'd managed to keep standing, but there weren't enough structures left on his property to house them all. The west shed had collapsed in October. The north fence line had come down in November. He'd been patching and praying, holding things together with wire and willpower, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Should have sold when I had the chance, he said to his reflection in the window. Could have walked away with something. Now there's nothing left to sell but failure. The fire popped behind him, and for a moment he saw his father's face in the window's reflection instead of his own. That stern, weathered face that had never shown doubt, never wavered in its certainty that the Porter Ranch would stand long after they were both gone. Sorry, Pa, Elias whispered. I tried. God knows I tried. But trying didn't pay debts. Trying didn't keep cattle alive through a winter that had come early and mean, with storms that seemed to line up like soldiers waiting their turn to attack. Trying didn't fill the empty spaces in a cabin that had once held laughter and the smell of his mother's cooking, back before the fever took her, and left his father a hollow man who worked himself into an early grave. Elias turned away from the window and looked around the cabin that had become more tomb than home. Dust-covered surfaces that used to gleam. Cobwebs draped the corners like funeral shrouds. The kitchen table where his family had once gathered for meals now held a scatter of unopened mail, unpaid bills, and a single plate he'd used and reused without bothering to wash properly. When had he stopped caring? When had survival become so exhausting that living had ceased to matter? He moved back to his chair and finally picked up the whiskey bottle. As he pulled the cork free, His eye caught on an envelope half buried under a pile of bank notices. The return address read, Harrington's Matrimonial Services, St. Louis, Missouri. The marriage broker. Elias stared at that envelope as if seeing it for the first time, though it had been sitting there for 2 weeks. He'd written to them in a moment of desperate foolishness back in September, when the loneliness had gotten so heavy he could barely breathe under the weight of it. He'd filled out their form half-drunk and wholly convinced that a wife, any wife, might make the empty cabin feel less like a coffin. Rancher, age 34, seeking companionable woman for marriage, he'd written. Must be willing to work hard and weather difficult times. Wyoming territory. Simple life. Honest man. He'd expected nothing to come of it. Who would answer such a pathetic advertisement? What woman in her right mind would travel to the edge of nowhere to marry a stranger who couldn't even promise her a comfortable life? But someone had answered. Clara Whitlock, age 28, formerly of Kansas. The broker's letter had arrived in October with her particulars. Schoolteacher, unmarried, willing to relocate for the purpose of marriage. She'd included a photograph, a serious-faced woman with dark hair pinned severely back, looking directly at the camera with an expression that betrayed neither hope nor fear, just a kind of steady determination. He'd written back, sent money for her travel expenses, made arrangements for her to arrive by coach to Sweetwater Valley, where he'd meet her, and they'd be married by Reverend Walsh before Christmas. But that had been before the storms hit, before his last hope of saving the ranch had frozen to death in the fields, before he'd realized that bringing a woman out here now would be nothing short of cruelty. 3 days ago, he'd sent a telegram to the coach station in Laramie. Do not allow Clara Whitlock to continue to Sweetwater. Send her back to Kansas. We'll reimburse all expenses. It was the only decent thing to do. Let her escape this sinking ship while she still could. Elias raised the whiskey bottle to his lips, then paused as a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a sound that didn't belong in the symphony of the storm. Knocking. He froze, bottle halfway to his mouth, certain he'd imagined it. The wind could play tricks on a man, could make him hear voices in its screaming, see shapes in its swirling white chaos. Then it came again. 3 distinct knocks, solid and deliberate, against the cabin's front door. The whiskey bottle slipped from his fingers and hit the floor, rolling across the worn boards. Elias stood slowly, his heart suddenly pounding against his ribs. No one would be out in this storm. No one could be. It was suicide to travel in weather like this, the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes if he lost his way. Another knock. Weaker this time, but unmistakable. He crossed the cabin in 4 long strides and threw back the bolt, hauling the door open against the wind that tried to slam it shut again. Snow and ice howled into the room, and there, on his doorstep, backlit by the swirling white darkness, stood a woman. She was covered in snow from head to foot, her dark cloak crusted with ice, her face pale as death except for her lips, which had gone an alarming shade of blue. In her gloved hand she clutched a small traveling case, and when she raised her eyes to meet his, Elias saw that they were the color of slate, gray and determined and filled with a stubbornness that had somehow kept her alive long enough to knock on his door. "Mr. Porter?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, her words fighting through chattering teeth. "I'm Clara Whitlock, your bride." For a moment Elias could only stare, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were clearly showing him. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't be here. He'd sent the telegram. She should be safe in Kansas, not half frozen on his doorstep like some impossible ghost conjured by his guilt and loneliness. "What?" He started, but she swayed suddenly, her knees buckling. Instinct took over. He lunged forward, catching her before she hit the frozen ground, and hauled her inside. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, or maybe the shock was giving him strength he didn't know he had. He kicked the door shut against the storm and carried her to the chair by the fire, setting her down as gently as his panic allowed. "Jesus Christ, woman," he breathed, kneeling before her and starting to work at the frozen buttons of her cloak. "What the hell were you thinking?" "The coach," she managed through chattering teeth. "Broken axle. 3 miles out. Driver said we had to wait for rescue. But I heard him tell the other passengers it could be days before anyone came. And I thought, I knew you were close. I remembered the map, so I walked. You walked. Elias got her cloak off and started on her gloves, which had frozen stiff. You walked 3 miles through a blizzard. 5, actually. I got turned around once. A ghost of a smile flickered across her blue lips. Almost ended up in Montana. He would have laughed if he weren't so terrified. Her fingers, when he finally freed them from the gloves, were white and waxy, the early stages of frostbite. He began rubbing them gently, trying to restore circulation without causing more damage. Why? The word came out harsher than he intended. Why would you risk your life like that? I sent a telegram. They should have turned you back in Laramie. Never got any telegram. Clara's teeth were still chattering, but some color was starting to return to her cheeks. I left Laramie yesterday morning. We were supposed to arrive by nightfall, but the storm, it came so fast. Elias closed his eyes. The telegram must have arrived after she'd already left. Of course, because nothing in his life was allowed to work out right. He stood and moved to the kitchen, grabbing the pot of coffee that had been keeping lukewarm by the stove. It was hours old and probably tasted like tar, but it was hot, and that was all that mattered. He poured a cup and brought it back to her, wrapping her still trembling hands around the warm ceramic. "Drink," he ordered, slowly. She obeyed, sipping carefully, her eyes closing as the warmth began to seep into her. Up close, out of the storm, she looked different from her photograph. Younger, maybe, though there were lines around her eyes that spoke of hardship. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in damp tangles around her shoulders. She had a small scar above her right eyebrow and a spattering of freckles across her nose that the photograph hadn't captured. She looked, he realized with a jolt, real. Not like the fantasy bride he'd half-created in his desperate mind, but like an actual woman, flesh and blood and complicated in ways he hadn't prepared himself for. "Miss Whitlock," he began. "Clara," she interrupted softly. "If we're to be married, you should call me Clara." "Clara." He sat back on his heels, running a hand through his hair. "Listen, about the marriage. Things have changed since I wrote those letters." She lowered the coffee cup and looked at him steadily. Despite the chattering that still shook her frame, despite the obvious exhaustion in her features, her gaze was clear and sharp. "You mean the ranch is failing?" she said. It wasn't a question. Elias felt heat rise to his face. "How did you— your letters?" She gestured weakly toward her traveling case, which he'd dropped by the door. "They were sparse, careful, the kind of letters a man writes when he's trying not to lie but can't quite bring himself to tell the whole truth. And now I see this cabin, and I understand why." He looked around at the disrepair he'd stopped noticing, seeing it suddenly through her eyes, the dust, the neglect, the creeping decay of a place where a man had stopped living and just started waiting to die. "It's worse than it looks," he said quietly. "I've got maybe 30 head of cattle left, half of them sick or starving. The bank owns more of this land than I do. The barn's got holes in the roof. The fences are down. I can't pay you the life I promised in those letters because I don't have a life to offer anymore." Clara was quiet for a long moment, still cradling the coffee cup. Then she said, "Did you know that my father was a gambler?" The non sequitur threw him. "What?" "A gambler," she repeated. "Oh, he had many fine qualities. He was charming, educated, could quote Shakespeare and play the piano beautifully. But he was also a gambler, and gamblers always lose in the end. He lost our house when I was 16, lost my mother's jewelry, lost everything except the clothes on our backs and the shame we wore like second skins." She took another sip of coffee before continuing. "I became a teacher because it was one of the few respectable jobs available to a disgraced gambler's daughter. I was good at it, loved the children, but then my father got into debt with the wrong man, a wealthy rancher named Silas Burnham, who decided that the debt could be forgiven if I agreed to marry him." Her hands tightened around the cup. "I refused. Silas was persistent, threatening, said he'd have my father arrested, that he'd ruin what little reputation I had left. So I ran. Used every penny I'd saved to answer your advertisement and buy a ticket west, because I decided that marrying an honest stranger in Wyoming was a better gamble than staying within reach of a dishonest man in Kansas." She raised her eyes to his again, and Elias saw something fierce burning in that gray gaze, something that looked like determination seasoned with desperation, a combination he understood all too well. So you see, Mr. Porter, I didn't come here expecting paradise. I came here expecting a chance. And whether your ranch is thriving or failing doesn't change the fact that I need that chance. I need somewhere that Silas Burnham can't find me, somewhere I can build something new, even if it's built on failing foundations. Elias stared at her, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It felt almost like, not hope, exactly. Hope was still too far out of reach, but maybe the shadow of hope, the possibility that hope might one day return. You walked 5 miles through a killer blizzard, he said slowly. For a chance. I did. That's either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever heard. A real smile crossed her face this time, brief but genuine. I've been told I have a gift for occupying the space between bravery and foolishness. Despite everything, the storm, the dying ranch, the impossible situation, Elias felt his own mouth twitch toward a smile. When was the last time he'd smiled? He couldn't remember. He stood and moved to the stove, ladling out a bowl of the thin stew he'd made that morning. It wasn't much, more broth than meat, with a few tired vegetables thrown in, but it was hot, and she needed it. Here, he said, bringing it to her. You need to eat. Get your strength back. Clara accepted the bowl with a murmured thanks and began eating with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Elias settled into the chair across from her, watching the firelight play across her features and trying to reconcile the reality of her presence with the lonely fantasy he'd created. The coach, he said after a moment. The other passengers. They're still out there? Clara nodded, swallowing. Driver and 2 others, an older couple from Ohio. They have blankets, and the coach provides some shelter. The driver said he'd fire signal shots once the storm cleared, that help would come then. She paused. I told them I was walking to find help. They thought I was mad. They were right. Perhaps. She took another bite of stew. But I'm here and alive, so perhaps madness has its advantages. Or perhaps you were just lucky. I don't believe in luck, Mr. Porter. I believe in determination and divine providence, though I'm never quite sure where one ends and the other begins. Elias leaned back in his chair, studying her. She was still shivering slightly, her lips still pale, but color was returning to her cheeks and her hands had steadied on the bowl. She was recovering. Against all odds, she was recovering. Clara, he said, I need you to understand something. Even if we went through with the marriage, I can't promise you security. I can barely feed myself. This ranch is hanging on by a thread, and that thread's about to snap. You'd be tying yourself to a sinking ship. Then perhaps we'll sink together, Clara said calmly. Or perhaps we'll find a way to bail out the water and patch the holes. But either way, it's better than drowning alone, don't you think? There was something in her voice, a quiet certainty that seemed to fill the empty spaces of the cabin. Elias felt it settle over him like a blanket, warm and unexpected. You're a strange woman, he said. So I've been told. She finished the stew and set the bowl aside. Do you have somewhere I can sleep tonight? I'm afraid if I don't lie down soon, I'll fall down. My bedroom. He stood quickly. You take my bed. I'll sleep out here by the fire. I can't take your... You can, and you will. You're half frozen and exhausted. I'm neither. He moved to the bedroom door and pushed it open, gesturing inside. It's not much, but the bed's clean and there are extra blankets in the trunk at the foot. Clara rose unsteadily, swaying slightly. Elias moved to help her, taking her elbow to steady her. She felt fragile under his hand, delicate as a bird, and he wondered again at the strength it must have taken to walk through that storm. Thank you, she said softly, as he guided her to the bedroom door. Then she paused and looked up at him. Mr. Porter, Elias, I know this isn't what you expected. I know I'm not what you expected. But I'm here now, and I'm not someone who gives up easily. So whatever happens tomorrow, whatever decisions we need to make, let's make them with clear heads and full bellies, shall we? He nodded, not trusting himself to speak around the sudden tightness in his throat. Clara squeezed his arm once, gently, then disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Elias stood there for a long moment, staring at that closed door, trying to understand what had just happened to his carefully ordered plan to die alone and unmourned. Then he turned back to the fire, added another log, and settled into his chair to keep watch through the long night while the storm raged on outside and something impossible happened inside, something that felt almost like hope beginning to wake from its long winter sleep. The storm finally broke just before dawn, leaving the world wrapped in a silence so complete it felt holy. Elias had dozed fitfully through the night, jerking awake at every sound, half convinced that Clara would vanish like a fever dream if he let himself truly sleep. But when the first gray light began to seep through the windows and he checked the bedroom door, she was still there. Curled up under every blanket he owned, her dark hair spread across the pillow, sleeping with the deep exhaustion of someone who'd finally reached safety after a long and desperate flight. He let her sleep and stepped outside into the transformed world. Snow lay thick and pure over everything, smoothing the rough edges of his failing ranch into something almost beautiful. The barn stood like a white ghost against the pale sky. The fence posts wore caps of snow. Even the collapsed shed looked picturesque under its frozen blanket. But beauty didn't feed cattle or pay debts. Elias trudged through the knee-deep drifts toward the barn, his breath pluming white in the bitter air. His hands shook as he reached for the barn door, not from cold, but from fear of what he'd find inside. The door creaked open. He stepped into the dim interior, and the smell hit him first. Not the smell of death he'd been expecting, but the warm animal smell of living cattle. He counted quickly, his heart hammering. 23. He'd put 25 in the barn last night. 2 losses. Bad, but not the catastrophe he'd feared. Some of them looked rough. There were a few he'd need to check carefully, watch for signs of fever or freezing. But they'd survived. Against the odds, they'd survived. He moved among them, checking their conditions, and was so absorbed in the work that he didn't hear the barn door open again. Didn't know he wasn't alone until a voice, her voice, spoke from behind him. "How many did you lose?" Elias spun around. Clara stood in the barn doorway, wrapped in her still damp cloak, her breath frosting in the cold air. Her face was pale, but determined, and she was looking at the cattle with the assessing gaze of someone who understood what she was seeing. 2, he said. "Maybe more in the outer sheds. I haven't checked yet." She nodded and stepped fully into the barn, moving among the cattle with surprising confidence. She stopped by a red heifer that Elias had been worried about. The animal was shivering despite the shelter, its eyes dull. "This one's sick," Clara said, laying a hand on the heifer's flank. "Fever, I think. Respiratory infection, maybe." "How did you—" "My grandfather raised cattle in Kansas before he died." Clara moved to the next stall, examining another animal. "I spent summers on his farm, learned to spot the signs." She turned to face him. "Do you have any willow bark, dried herbs? Anything medicinal?" "There's some things in the house. My mother used to keep remedies." "Show me." And just like that, without any discussion or decision, Clara had rolled up her sleeves and gone to work. She spent the next hour going through the meager collection of dried herbs and roots Elias's mother had left behind, her hands moving with practiced certainty as she selected what she needed. Then she was back in the barn, mixing treatments, dosing the sick cattle, her voice low and soothing as she worked. Elias watched her, something shifting in his chest. This woman who'd nearly frozen to death 12 hours ago was now hip-deep in his failing ranch, fighting for his cattle as if they were her own. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. Clara looked up from the paste she was mixing, willow bark, and something else he didn't recognize. "Because they need help," she said simply, "and because I can help them." "You don't owe me anything. We're not even married." "No," she agreed, "we're not. But we're also not strangers anymore, are we? You opened your door to me last night, gave me shelter, fed me, offered me safety." She returned her attention to her work. "The least I can do is help you save what's left of your herd. It might not be enough. Saving a few sick cattle won't save the ranch." "Perhaps not." Clara moved to the sick heifer and began applying the paste to the animal's chest, working it into the hide with firm, gentle motions. "But we don't know that yet, do we? We don't know what tomorrow brings. All we can do is try today and see where it leads." Elias opened his mouth to argue, to tell her that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, that trying was just a way to prolong the inevitable pain. But before he could speak, Clara started singing. It was a hymn, one he recognized from childhood, from Sunday services when his mother would stand beside him in church, and their voices would blend together. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Her voice was clear and true, filling the barn with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the kind of faith Elias had forgotten was possible. As she sang, her hands never stopped moving, never stopped working to save the animal beneath them. And Elias found himself remembering something his father had said once, years ago, when Elias was young and impatient and certain he had all the answers. Son, the Lord doesn't always send help the way we expect it. Sometimes he sends a stranger. Sometimes he sends a storm. And sometimes, if we're blessed, he sends both together, so we can learn to see his hand in the impossible things. Standing in that barn, watching this impossible woman sing hymns to his dying cattle while mixing remedies with hands that should still be too frozen to work, Elias felt something crack open inside him, some hard, protective shell he'd built around his heart. Maybe she was right. Maybe they didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe all they could do was try today and see where it led. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was something close enough to hope that Elias could almost remember what hope had felt like, back before the world had taught him to stop believing in answered prayers. Clara, he said softly. She paused in her singing and looked up at him, her gray eyes steady and calm. Thank you, he said, for coming, for staying, for this. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her look suddenly, startlingly beautiful, despite the barn dirt on her cheek and the cow paste on her hands. You're welcome, Elias Porter, she said. Now come here and help me with this stubborn heifer. She needs both of us if she's going to pull through. And so he did. Side by side in the cold barn, while the Christmas morning sun rose over the snow-covered Wyoming wilderness, they worked together to save what could be saved. Two lost souls who'd found each other in a storm, learning to believe again in the possibility of grace. By the time they finished with the cattle, the sun had climbed higher, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Clara's hands were chapped and red despite the gloves Elias had found for her, and exhaustion had carved deeper lines around her eyes. But the sick heifer was standing steadier now, and two other animals that had looked near death were eating hay with renewed interest. You need rest, Elias said as they walked back toward the cabin, their boots crunching through the frozen crust. You barely slept, and you've been working all morning. I'll rest when the work is done. Clara stumbled slightly, and Elias caught her elbow to steady her. She didn't pull away, just leaned into his support for a moment before straightening. Though I could use some breakfast. That stew last night was wonderful, but it's wearing off. Stew wasn't wonderful. It was barely adequate. Compared to nothing, adequate is wonderful. She smiled up at him, and he noticed for the first time that her eyes had tiny flecks of blue in the gray, like chips of sky trapped in storm clouds. You'd be surprised how low your standards drop when you're desperate enough. They reached the cabin, and Elias pushed open the door, letting her enter first. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals, and the cold had crept back in like an unwelcome guest. While Clara sank into a chair, Elias rebuilt the fire and put coffee on to boil. Then he pulled out the last of his eggs, 4 precious specimens he'd been hoarding, and the heel of bread that was only slightly stale. This is too much, Clara protested when she saw what he was preparing. I can't afford to have you collapse from hunger, either. He cracked the eggs into his mother's old iron skillet. Besides, Christmas is supposed to be about abundance, isn't it? Even if it's just the abundance of 4 eggs and some bread. Christmas! Clara looked around the cabin as if seeing it properly for the first time. I'd forgotten it was Christmas. Easy to forget out here. Doesn't feel much like the holiday. He glanced at her. Did you have plans? Family expecting you? Her expression closed slightly, like a door being gently shut. No family left. My father died 3 months ago, pneumonia. That's when Silas became more aggressive about collecting the debt. Without my father around to even pretend to protect me. She trailed off, then seemed to shake herself. But that's behind me now, or at least I hope it is. Elias divided the eggs onto 2 tin plates and brought them to the table along with the bread. Clara ate with the same focused intensity she'd shown the night before, and he found himself wondering when she'd last had a proper meal. The journey from Kansas to Wyoming was long and expensive. Had she been rationing her money, skipping meals to save pennies? "Tell me about the ranch," Clara said between bites. "Your letters mentioned it was your father's. How long has it been in your family?" 15 years. My father came west after the war, Civil War, looking for a fresh start. He'd seen too much death back east, wanted to build something living instead. He found this valley, filed his claim, and spent the next 10 years breaking his back to make it work. Elias stared down at his eggs, not really seeing them. It worked too. For a while. We had good years. Built the barn, expanded the herd. My mother made the cabin into a real home. What happened? Life happened. Death happened. He pushed eggs around his plate. My mother died of fever when I was 22. My father followed her 4 years later. Heart just gave out one day while he was mending fence. And He paused, trying to find words for the slow collapse that had followed. I thought I could hold it together. Thought if I just worked hard enough, I could keep everything going the way they'd built it. But the drought came. Then the hard winters. Then the cattle prices dropped. Turns out hard work isn't always enough. Clara reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Her palm was warm despite the cold cabin, and the gesture was so unexpected that Elias froze. "I'm sorry," she said simply, "for your losses, and I'm sorry that you've been carrying this alone." He looked at their hands, his rough and scarred from years of labor, hers smaller but equally marked by work. "You don't even know me," he said quietly. "Why do you care?" "Because I know what it feels like to watch something precious slip away while you fight with everything you have to hold on." She squeezed his hand once before withdrawing. "And because loneliness recognizes loneliness, Elias. I saw it in your letters, even the ones where you tried to sound confident. I heard it in the spaces between your words." Before he could respond, a sound cut through the morning quiet, 3 sharp gunshots in rapid succession, echoing across the snow-covered valley. Clara jumped. "What was that?" "Signal shots." Elias was already on his feet, reaching for his coat. "The coach. They're calling for help now that the storm's cleared. We have to go to them." "I'll go. You stay here and rest." "Absolutely not." Clara stood, wavering only slightly. "They're out there because of me, because I left them to walk here. I'm coming." Elias wanted to argue, but one look at her face told him it would be useless. That same stubborn determination that had carried her through 5 miles of blizzard was fixed in her expression now. "Fine," he conceded, "but we take the wagon and the horse, and you wear every warm thing I can find." 20 minutes later, they were moving through the snow-draped landscape, Elias driving the wagon while his old draft horse, Samson, plowed through drifts that came up to his chest. Clara sat beside him, wrapped in so many layers of clothing she looked twice her normal size, a blanket pulled up to her chin. "I must look ridiculous," she said. "You look warm. That's what matters." They found the stranded coach about 4 miles out, exactly where Clara had said it would be. The vehicle sat at an angle in a snowbank, its broken axle clearly visible. 3 figures emerged from inside as the wagon approached, a silver-haired man and woman clinging to each other, and the driver, a grizzled character with a frost-covered beard. "Thank God," the driver called out. "We saw your smoke this morning, figured someone was close, been firing signals for an hour." His eyes landed on Clara, and his weathered face split into a grin of relief. "Miss Whitlock, you made it. We thought for sure you were dead in a drift somewhere. Takes more than a little snow to stop me, Mr. Parsons." Clara climbed down from the wagon with Elias's help. "Mr. and Mrs. Henley, are you all right?" The older couple nodded, though they looked half frozen despite their heavy coats. Mrs. Henley's lips were blue, and her husband supported most of her weight. "We need to get them warm," Clara said to Elias. "Mrs. Henley especially, she's showing signs of exposure." They loaded the 3 passengers into the wagon, and Elias turned Samson back toward the ranch. The return journey took longer with the extra weight, and by the time they reached the cabin, Mrs. Henley was barely conscious. What followed was a blur of activity. Clara took charge with the quiet authority of someone who'd done this before. Directing Elias to build up the fire, while she got Mrs. Henley out of her wet clothes and wrapped in dry blankets. Mister, Henley hovered anxiously, wringing his hands, while Parsons, the driver, helped Elias heat water and prepare more of the thin coffee. Your wife knows what she's doing, Parsons observed, watching Clara work. She's not my wife, Elias said automatically, then caught himself. Not yet, anyway. It's complicated. Complicated is just another word for interesting. Parsons accepted a cup of coffee. You're a lucky man, complicated or not. That woman's got steel in her spine. An hour later, Mrs. Henley had color back in her cheeks and was sipping hot broth while her husband fussed over her. The cabin was crowded with 5 people instead of 1, but the presence of others had transformed the space. Suddenly it felt alive again, filled with voices and movement and the kind of warmth that came from human connection rather than just fire. We can't thank you enough, Mr. Henley said to Elias and Clara both. When that axle broke and the storm hit, I thought we'd be spending Christmas frozen to death in that coach. You're safe now, Clara assured him. That's what matters. How long until the road's passable? Elias asked Parsons. The driver scratched his beard, thinking. Storm dumped near 2 feet, maybe more in drifts. Road won't be clear for 3-4 days at least. We'll need to send word to Sweetwater, get a crew out to fix the coach. He looked apologetic. Hate to impose, but we'll need somewhere to stay until then. Elias felt panic flutter in his chest. He could barely feed himself, let alone 4 extra mouths. But before he could figure out how to explain their situation without sounding like a complete failure, Clara spoke up. Of course you'll stay here, she said firmly. We'll make do. It's Christmas after all. The Henleys looked relieved. Parsons nodded gratefully, and Elias felt the walls of his carefully constructed isolation crumbling further. That afternoon, while the guests rested, Clara pulled Elias aside. We need to assess what supplies we have, she said quietly. If we're feeding 5 people for several days, we need to know what we're working with. Together they inventoried the pantry. The results were grim. A sack of flour with maybe 10 pounds left, half a sack of dried beans, some salt pork that had seen better days, a few jars of preserved vegetables from God knows when, and a handful of root vegetables from the cellar that were starting to sprout. This is what you've been living on? Clara asked, her voice carefully neutral. I've been making do. You've been starving yourself. She turned to face him, her expression serious. Elias, this isn't enough to sustain 1 person, let alone 5 for 4 days. I know. He rubbed his face with both hands. I'll ride to Sweetwater tomorrow, see if I can buy supplies on credit. Maybe old Joe will extend me 1 more line. Or, Clara said slowly, we could provide for ourselves. With what? There's cattle. You have cattle, don't you? Elias stared at her. You want me to slaughter one of my herd? Clara, those animals are all I have left. They're my seed stock, my future. They're also food. Her tone was gentle but firm. And what good is seed stock if you starve before spring? 1 animal, carefully butchered and preserved, could feed all of us through the rest of winter, plus give you something to trade in town. I can't, he started, but she cut him off. Yes, you can, and you will, because it's the smart choice. She softened slightly, touching his arm. I know it feels like giving up, like admitting defeat, but it's not. It's making a strategic sacrifice to survive long enough to rebuild. Your father would understand that. Would he? Elias wasn't sure. His father had never slaughtered breeding stock, had always found another way. But his father had also never faced the kind of perfect storm of disasters that had brought the ranch to its knees. The old bull, he said finally. He's past breeding age anyway. I was going to try to sell him in spring, but... He trailed off, then nodded. All right, I'll do it tomorrow. Clara's shoulders relaxed slightly. Good. And I'll help with the butchering. I know how. Of course you do. He found himself almost smiling. Is there anything you don't know how to do? Play the piano. I'm absolutely terrible at it. And I can't draw worth a damn. Everything I sketch looks like it was done by a drunk chicken. She returned his almost smile. But butchering cattle? That I can manage. That evening, they gathered around the table for a strange Christmas dinner. More of Elias's inadequate stew, stretched thin to feed 5 mouths, with the last of the bread divided into tiny portions. It should have been depressing, this meager meal in a failing ranch with strangers forced together by circumstance. But somehow it wasn't. Mr. Henley told stories about his years as a shopkeeper in Ohio, making them all laugh with his tales of difficult customers and inventory mishaps. Mrs. Henley, recovered from her ordeal, sang a Christmas carol in a quavering but sweet voice. Parsons the driver contributed whiskey from his flask, enough to give everyone a warming sip. And Clara transformed the cabin simply by being in it. She moved through the small space with unconscious grace, refilling cups, stirring the fire, her voice rising and falling as she joined in the singing. More than once, Elias caught himself just watching her, marveling at how different the cabin felt with her presence. "You're staring," she whispered to him when the others were distracted by one of Mr. Henley's stories. "Sorry." "Don't be sorry, just tell me why." He struggled for words. "You make this place feel like a home again," he said finally. "I'd forgotten what that was like." Her eyes softened. "You make it easy to want to try." Late that night, after their guests had settled down to sleep, the Henleys in Elias's bedroom, Parsons rolled in blankets by the fire, and Clara insisting she was fine curled up in the spare chair, Elias stood at the window looking out at the moonlit snow. "Can't sleep?" Clara's voice came softly from behind him. He turned. She'd wrapped herself in one of his mother's old quilts, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. In the dim firelight, she looked almost ethereal. "Too much thinking," he admitted. "About tomorrow? The bull?" "About everything. About how a week ago I was ready to give up, and now I'm butchering cattle to feed strangers and planning like there might actually be a future." Clara moved to stand beside him at the window. "Having hope again is frightening, isn't it? When you've learned not to hope, letting it back in feels like inviting heartbreak." "You understand?" "I do." She was quiet for a moment. "When I was on that coach and the axle broke, do you know what my first thought was? It was relief. Relief that I had an excuse to fail, to not make it here, to not have to face whatever disappointment was waiting, because at least if I died in that storm, I wouldn't have to watch another dream fall apart." "But you didn't die." "No. I got angry instead." She smiled slightly. "Angry at Silas Burnham for driving me to this. Angry at my father for dying and leaving me vulnerable. Angry at God for making life so damn hard. And somewhere in all that anger, I remembered that I'm too stubborn to let any of them win, so I started walking." "Toward what? You didn't know what you'd find here." "No," she agreed, "but I knew what I'd left behind. And sometimes moving toward unknown possibility is better than staying with known misery." She turned to look at him. "You wrote in one of your letters that you were an honest man looking for companionship to weather difficult times. That was enough for me to take a chance on. Was I wrong?" "No," Elias said quietly. "You weren't wrong. I am honest. I'm also broken, Clara. This ranch is broken. I don't know if either of us can be fixed. Then maybe we'll stay broken together. Maybe broken doesn't need to be fixed. Maybe it just needs to find a way to keep functioning anyway." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I'm not afraid of broken things, Elias. I'm one of them." He looked down at their joined hands, two broken people holding on to each other in the darkness of Christmas night, neither sure where they were going but willing to try the journey together. "We should get married," he said suddenly. Clara's eyes widened. "What?" "We should get married, properly. Not because the letters arranged it, but because I think we might actually be able to help each other. Because you're here, and I'm here, and we're both trying to survive something. Because—" He stopped, struggling for the right words. "Because I don't want you to leave when the coach is fixed. And if you're my wife, you'd have legal protection. Silas Burnham couldn't touch you." "Elias, I know it's not romantic. I know I can't promise you anything but hard work and uncertainty. But I can promise you honesty and partnership. I can promise you'll never face things alone again." He squeezed her hand. "That has to count for something." Clara was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse. Then she said, "Can I tell you something? When I saw your photograph, the one you sent with your first letter, I thought you had sad eyes. eyes that had seen too much loss. And I thought, here's someone who understands what it means to keep going even when you're not sure why. That's what made me answer. Not your ranch or your promises, just the recognition of someone who knew what surviving felt like. Is that a yes? It's a let's see what tomorrow brings. She smiled. Let's butcher that bull. Let's feed our unexpected guests. Let's get through the next 4 days, and if at the end of it you still think marrying a woman you barely know is a good idea, then we'll talk to Reverend Walsh. She paused. But Elias, I think we should do this right, court each other properly, even if the courtship is compressed into a few days. Because if we're going to tie our lives together, I want it to be because we chose it with clear heads, not because we were both desperate. He felt something warm bloom in his chest. Respect, maybe, or admiration for her practical wisdom. That's fair. That's more than fair. Good. She released his hand and pulled the quilt tighter around herself. Now, let's both get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a hard day and we'll need our strength. She started toward her chair, then paused and turned back. Before Elias could react, she stood on her toes and pressed a quick, soft kiss to his cheek. "Merry Christmas, Elias Porter," she whispered. "Thank you for opening your door to me." Then she was gone, curled back in her chair, leaving Elias standing by the window with his hand pressed to his cheek where her lips had been, feeling like maybe, just maybe, Grace wasn't as far out of reach as he'd thought. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Elias woke early, before the others, and stood over the old bull in the far pasture. The animal was 15 years old, gray around the muzzle, his breeding days long behind him. He'd been a good bull once, strong and fertile, the foundation of Elias's herd. Slaughtering him felt like killing a piece of the ranch's history. "I'm sorry, old friend," Elias murmured, "but we need what you can give us more than we need you standing in this field." Clara found him there an hour later, after the work was done and the carcass was hanging in the barn to cool. He was sitting on a bale of hay, staring at nothing, his hands stained with blood he hadn't bothered to wash off yet. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him and leaned her shoulder against his. They stayed like that for a long time, two people sharing a moment of grief for what had to be sacrificed so that something else might survive. "My grandfather used to say," Clara finally spoke, "that ranching teaches you the hardest lesson there is. That loving something sometimes means letting it die so something else can live. It doesn't make it hurt less, but it makes it meaningful." "Your grandfather sounds like he was wise." "He was. Mean as a snake when he was angry, but wise." She straightened, brushing hay from her skirt. "Come on, let's get that meat butchered and preserved. And then we're going to cook a proper Christmas dinner for our guests, even if it's a day late. That bull deserves to be appreciated, not just mourned." Over the next 3 days, as they waited for the road to clear and the coach to be repaired, something shifted in the cabin. What had started as awkward crowding became something close to community. Clara taught Mrs. Henley how to make her willow bark remedy for aches and pains. Mr. Henley helped Elias repair the leak in the barn roof they'd been ignoring. Parsons, it turned out, was skilled with leatherwork and spent an afternoon fixing the harnesses that Elias had jury-rigged with wire. And through it all, Clara moved like the heart of the operation, cooking, cleaning, organizing, her voice constantly lifting in song or conversation, bringing warmth to every corner she touched. Elias watched her transform his dying ranch into something that felt alive again, and he began to understand what she'd meant about broken things finding a way to keep functioning. She wasn't fixing anything, not really. She was just teaching it all. The ranch, the cabin, Elias himself. How to work while broken, how to keep going despite the cracks. On the 4th day, Parsons announced that the coach had been repaired and the road was passable. The Henleys prepared to leave with genuine sadness. "You've been so kind," Mrs. Henley said to Clara, embracing her. "If you ever find yourself in Ohio, you'll have a place to stay." "And young man," Mr. Henley said to Elias, shaking his hand, "don't let this one get away. A woman who can sing hymns while butchering cattle is rarer than gold." After they'd gone, the cabin felt suddenly empty, and Elias realized with a start that he'd gotten used to having people around. The loneliness rushed back in like water filling a hole, and he understood with crystal clarity that he couldn't go back to how things had been before. "Clara," he said. She turned from where she was cleaning up the breakfast dishes. Yes? I meant what I said. About marriage. About partnership. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. They were still chapped and red from days of hard work, but they were warm and alive. I know it's only been a handful of days. I know we're still practically strangers, but I also know that I don't want to face another winter alone. And I hope, that maybe you feel the same. Clara studied his face for a long moment. Then she said, "Ask me properly." What? Ask me properly. Get down on one knee and ask me like you mean it, not like you're proposing a business arrangement. Elias felt his face heat, but he did as she asked. He knelt on the worn floorboards of his mother's kitchen, still holding her hands, and looked up into those storm-gray eyes. "Clara Whitlock," he said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected. "Will you marry me? Not because it's practical or convenient, not because we're both desperate or broken, but because I think we might be able to build something good together. Because you make this place feel like a home. Because I want to know what tomorrow looks like if you're standing beside me when it comes." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, catching the morning light. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Elias Porter, I'll marry you, because you opened your door to a stranger in a storm. Because you're honest about your failures. Because I'd rather build something new with you than run from something old alone." He stood and pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias felt something that might actually be hope taking root in the frozen ground of his heart. They were married 3 days later in the small church at Sweetwater Valley, with Reverend Walsh presiding and half the town in attendance, not because Elias had invited them, but because word had spread like wildfire about the mail-order bride who'd walked through a blizzard and brought the dying Porter Ranch back to life. Clara wore a simple dress of dark blue wool that Mrs. Henderson from the general store had insisted on lending her, and she'd pinned her hair up with wildflowers that somehow still bloomed in the church's sheltered garden despite the winter cold. Elias stood beside her in his father's old Sunday suit, feeling like an imposter in the too-tight collar. But when Clara turned to him and smiled, everything else fell away. "I do," she said when the moment came, her voice clear and certain. "I do," Elias echoed, and meant it with every fiber of his being. When Reverend Walsh pronounced them man and wife, the small congregation erupted in applause. Old Joe Mackenzie clapped Elias on the back hard enough to make him stumble. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even stern-faced Thomas Garrett, who owned the neighboring ranch and had been predicting the Porter place would fail for 2 years, nodded with something that might have been approval. But it was what happened after the ceremony that changed everything. They were standing outside the church, accepting congratulations, when a tall, weathered man with kind eyes approached them. He wore the rough clothes of a working rancher, but his bearing suggested someone who'd seen more of the world than Sweetwater Valley. "Mr. Porter? Mrs. Porter?" He tipped his hat to Clara. "Name's William Bradford. I run the Circle B spread about 10 miles east of here." "Mr. Bradford." Elias shook his hand, wary. He'd heard of the Circle B. It was one of the largest operations in the territory, successful enough to weather any storm. "What can I do for you?" "It's more what I can do for you, perhaps." Bradford glanced at Clara. "Word spread about your wife's skill with sick animals. I heard she saved half your herd when they should have died from that Christmas storm." "She did," Elias said, surprised by the pride in his own voice. "She's got a gift." "I've got 3 horses down with something I can't figure out," Bradford continued. "They're valuable breeding stock, and my regular veterinarian is stuck in Cheyenne until the mountain pass is clear. I'd pay good money if your wife would take a look at them." Clara's eyes widened. "Mr. Bradford, I'm not a veterinarian. I just know some remedies my grandfather taught me." "Sometimes old remedies work better than new science." Bradford pulled out a worn leather wallet. "I'll pay $20 if you'll come look, and if you can save even one of those horses, I'll pay 50 more. $20. Elias felt his heart skip. That was more than he'd made in the last 3 months combined. He looked at Clara, saw the uncertainty in her face, and started to tell Bradford they couldn't accept. "I'll do it," Clara said quietly. "But I can't promise anything, Mr. Bradford. If they're beyond helping, then they're beyond helping, and I'll know I tried everything." Bradford handed her a card with his address. "Come tomorrow if you can." Bring whatever supplies you need. I'll cover the costs. After Bradford left, Elias turned to Clara. You don't have to do this. If you're not confident— I'm not confident, she interrupted. I'm terrified. But Elias, that's $20 just for looking. $20 would buy feed for the rest of the winter. We can't afford to turn it down. She was right, and they both knew it. So the next morning, they loaded the wagon with Clara's collection of herbs and remedies and made the 2-hour journey to the Circle B ranch. The spread was impressive: a large ranch house, multiple barns, endless fenced pastures. It made Elias's struggling operation look like a child's play farm in comparison. He felt shame curl in his stomach as they pulled up to the main barn, where Bradford was waiting. Thank you for coming. Bradford led them inside to 3 stalls where the horses stood. Even Elias could see they were in bad shape. Heads hanging low, coats dull, breathing labored. Clara moved among them slowly, examining each one with that same careful attention she'd given to Elias's cattle. She checked their eyes, their gums, felt along their necks and flanks. Then she knelt beside a water trough and ran her fingers through the water, bringing them to her nose. When did you last clean these troughs? She asked. Bradford frowned. We clean them every week, just did it 3 days ago. With what? Lye soap, same as always. Clara stood, wiping her hands on her skirt. Your horses don't have an illness, Mr. Bradford. They have poisoning. Lye poisoning from contaminated water. Someone used too much soap in the cleaning or didn't rinse properly, and the residue built up. These animals have been drinking poison for weeks, maybe months, in small enough doses that it didn't kill them outright, but enough to make them sick. Bradford's face went white. Jesus, I'll kill whoever did this. It was probably an accident, Clara said quickly. Someone being overzealous about cleanliness. The question now is whether we can save them. She turned to Elias. I need milk, fresh milk, as much as you can spare. And activated charcoal if you have it, or I can make it if you don't. And fresh water, clean water from a source nowhere near these troughs. Bradford snapped into action, shouting orders to his ranch hands. Within an hour, Clara had begun her treatment, forcing the horses to drink milk mixed with charcoal to absorb the toxins, flushing their systems with clean water, applying poultices to their stomachs to ease the inflammation. Elias watched her work with growing amazement. She moved with absolute certainty now, all her earlier fear burned away by the need to act. She talked to the horses constantly, her voice low and soothing, singing hymns between treatments. Where did you learn all this? Bradford asked, echoing Elias's thoughts. My grandfather, Clara said, not looking up from the horse she was tending. He raised cattle and horses in Kansas for 40 years. Said animals and people weren't so different. They both needed clean water, good food, and someone who paid attention when something went wrong. He taught me to pay attention. By evening, all 3 horses were showing improvement. Their breathing had eased and they'd begun to eat again. Bradford looked like he might weep with relief. You saved them, he said to Clara. You actually saved them. They're not out of danger yet, Clara cautioned. Someone will need to monitor them closely for the next week, continue the treatments. I'll hire you, Bradford interrupted, as a consultant. $20 a week to check on my stock, teach my men your remedies. More if you can help other ranchers in the area. I know at least 3 operations that have been losing animals to mysterious ailments. $20 a week. Elias felt dizzy. That was more money than the ranch had made in 6 months. That was enough to buy feed, pay down debt, maybe even hire help for spring branding. Mr. Bradford, Clara said carefully, I appreciate the offer, but I need to discuss this with my husband first. On the ride home, as the winter sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elias tried to process what had just happened. His mail-order bride, his wife of 3 days, had just been offered steady employment doing something she was apparently extraordinary at. You should accept, he said finally. Clara turned to look at him. You're sure? Clara, you just made in 1 day what would have taken me months to earn if I could have earned it at all. And Bradford mentioned other ranchers. If word spreads, you could build a real business. But the ranch will still be there. And maybe, with money coming in, we can actually save it. He reached over and took her hand. I won't pretend my pride isn't stinging a bit, having my wife be the breadwinner. But I'm not so proud that I'd turn down the chance to survive. It wouldn't be permanent, Clara said quietly. Just until we get back on our feet, and I'd still help with the ranch work. You'd better. I'm not doing all the cooking. He squeezed her hand. We're partners, remember? Partners use whatever advantages they have. Right now, your advantage is that you're apparently some kind of miracle worker with sick animals. A smile flickered across her face. Hardly a miracle worker, just observant. Same thing sometimes. But their hope was short-lived. When they arrived back at the ranch that evening, they found a man waiting on the porch, a stranger in expensive traveling clothes, sitting in one of Elias's rickety chairs like he owned the place. He stood as they approached, and Elias felt Clara go rigid beside him. "Hello, Clara," the man said smoothly. "It's been a long time." "Silas?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper, and all the color had drained from her face. "How did you find me?" Silas Burnham, because that's who this had to be, smiled without warmth. "Did you really think you could run from me? I have business interests in 6 states, Clara. When you disappeared, I simply hired men to check every coach station, every boarding house, every little frontier town between Kansas and California." He pulled out a telegram. "Imagine my surprise when one of them wired me about a mail-order bride who'd walked through a blizzard to reach Sweetwater Valley. Such a unique story. I knew it had to be you." Elias stepped between them, his hand moving instinctively to his hip, even though he wasn't wearing a gun. "You need to leave. Now." Silas barely glanced at him. "And you must be the desperate rancher who advertised for a wife. Tell me, did Clara mention that she's technically still engaged to me? That her father signed a contract before he died?" "My father was delirious with fever when he signed that paper," Clara said, finding her voice. "It's not legally binding. That's for lawyers to decide, don't you think?" Silas moved down the steps, and Elias noticed for the first time that there were 2 other men standing near the barn, large, rough-looking characters who had the air of hired muscle. "I'm a reasonable man, Clara. I've come all this way to bring you home, to honor the agreement your father made. Surely you won't embarrass us both by refusing." "She's married," Elias said flatly. "To me. 3 days ago, legal and binding." Silas's eyes went cold. "A marriage made under false pretenses. Clara was already promised to me. I could have it annulled." "You could try," Clara said, and Elias heard steel enter her voice. "But I'm not going anywhere with you, Silas. I meant what I said in my letter. I don't want your money, I don't want your ranch, and I certainly don't want you. Whatever debt my father owed died with him." "Debts don't die, Clara. They transfer." Silas pulled out another paper. "This is a promissory note for $1,500, signed by your father. Either you honor our engagement and the debt is forgiven, or I'll take payment from your new husband's property." He smiled at Elias. "I understand you're already deep in debt to the bank. I've purchased those debts, all of them. So either Clara comes with me, or I foreclose on this pathetic excuse for a ranch, and you both end up with nothing." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Elias felt rage and fear warring in his chest, felt his hands curling into fists. "You can't do that." "I can and I have. Check with your bank if you don't believe me." Silas tucked the papers back into his coat. "I'll give you until tomorrow to decide. Either Clara leaves with me or I start foreclosure proceedings. Your choice." He tipped his hat mockingly and walked toward the barn where a fancy carriage waited, his 2 hired men falling into step behind him. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance and a cloud of cold despair settling over the ranch. Clara sank onto the porch steps, her face in her hands. "I've ruined you," she whispered. "I've ruined everything." Elias sat beside her, his mind racing. $1,500. He didn't have $15, let alone $1,500. And if Silas really had bought his bank debts, and there was no reason to think he was lying, then the man owned him, owned the ranch, owned everything Elias's father had built, and everything he'd been trying desperately to save. "We'll fight this," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We'll get a lawyer." "With what money?" Clara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Elias, I can't let him take your ranch, your father's ranch, everything you've been fighting for. I'll go with him. No." The word came out harder than he intended. "Absolutely not. I didn't marry you to trade you away like property the first time someone made a threat. But, no, Clara. We'll find another way. He stood pacing the porch. Bradford offered you steady work. That's income, real income. And you said other ranchers might need help too. If we can prove to the bank that we have money coming in, it won't be enough, Clara said miserably. Not fast enough. Foreclosure proceedings take weeks, maybe months. But in the end, if we can't pay what's owed… She trailed off, and they both knew what she wasn't saying. In the end, they'd lose everything anyway. They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky and the temperature dropped toward freezing. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted. The wind rattled the loose boards on the barn. The ranch creaked and settled around them like something dying slowly. There has to be a way, Elias said finally. There has to be something we can do. Clara raised her head, and in the moonlight he saw something shift in her expression, fear giving way to determination. Maybe there is, she said slowly. Maybe Silas isn't the only one who can play games with money and leverage. What do you mean? She stood, brushing off her skirt. Tomorrow, I'm going to every ranch within 20 miles and offering my services. Not for $20 a week, for $50. And I'm going to tell them exactly what I did for Bradford's horses. I'm going to make myself so valuable, so necessary, that when Silas tries to take me away, he won't just be fighting you. He'll be fighting every rancher in Sweetwater Valley who depends on me. Clara, and you, she continued, her voice gaining strength, are going to figure out exactly how much we owe and exactly how much we can realistically make in the next month. We're going to go to the bank together and show them we have a plan, a real plan, with real income. They won't care. They'll listen to Silas's money not if we give them a better option. She grabbed his hands. Elias, Silas is a bully. Bullies are used to people backing down, giving in, running away, but I'm done running. And I don't think you're ready to give up your father's ranch without a fight. Are you? He looked at her, this woman who'd walked through a blizzard, who'd saved his cattle, who'd brought light back into his dark cabin and hope back into his dying heart. She was right. He wasn't ready to give up. Not anymore. No, he said. I'm not. Then we fight. Together. The next morning they split up. Elias rode to Sweetwater to meet with Jeremiah Holmes at the bank, while Clara took the wagon and started making rounds to the neighboring ranches. The meeting with Holmes went about as well as Elias expected, which is to say, not well at all. I'm sorry, Elias, the banker said, looking genuinely pained. But Mr. Burnham purchased your notes fair and square. He has every legal right to call them due. I understand that. But we have income now, real income. My wife has been hired by William Bradford as a livestock consultant, and other ranchers are interested. We can make payments, stay current. How much can you pay now? Today? Holmes interrupted. Elias hesitated. Nothing today, but by the end of the month. By the end of the month, Mr. Burnham will have started foreclosure proceedings. Holmes pulled out a ledger. You owe, in total, $1,843. Even if your wife makes $50 a week, which is generous, you'd need 9 months to pay it off, and that's not counting interest or your other expenses. 9 months. They didn't have 9 months. Elias felt the fight draining out of him. There is one option, Holmes said carefully. If you could make a significant payment, say half the total, I might be able to convince the bank to extend the terms on the rest. Show good faith. $900. Elias laughed bitterly. I don't have $900. I don't have $90. Then I'm sorry, son. But unless you can produce that kind of money… Holmes trailed off, and they both knew how that sentence ended. Elias rode back to the ranch in a fog of despair. They were finished. Clara's plan wouldn't work. There simply wasn't enough time to make enough money. They'd lose the ranch, and Silas Burnham would win. He'd take Clara back to Kansas, or Clara would refuse and they'd both be destitute, or… He stopped the horse abruptly. In the distance, he could see Clara's wagon approaching from the opposite direction, moving fast. When she got close enough, he saw her face was flushed with excitement. Elias, she called out. I've been to 4 ranches, and all 4 have hired me. Mrs. Patterson's sheep have hoof rot. I can treat that. The Michaels brothers have cattle with pink eye. Old man Jensen's draft horses are lame. And Thomas Garrett? Thomas Garrett, who hates you. Even he wants me to look at his breeding stock. She pulled up beside him, breathless. That's 4 contracts at $30 each per month, guaranteed for at least 3 months. That's, she did the math quickly, $360. More if they extend the contracts or if I can get more clients. Elias felt his heart sink. $360 was a fortune compared to what they had now, but it was nowhere near $900. Clara, he said gently, that's wonderful, really, but it's not enough. Her face fell. What do you mean? He told her about the meeting with Holmes, about the $900 they needed to show good faith, about how even with her income they'd never make it in time. Clara's shoulders slumped. So we've lost. Not yet. But even as he said it, Elias knew he was lying. They had lost. They just hadn't admitted it yet. They rode back to the ranch in silence. When they arrived, Silas Burnham was waiting again, this time sitting in the same spot on the porch, looking for all the world like a patient predator who knew his prey couldn't escape. Have you made your decision? He asked pleasantly. We need more time, Elias said. Time for what? To dig yourselves deeper into debt? Silas stood. I'm a generous man, so I'll give you 1 more day. But Clara, understand this. If you don't come with me voluntarily, I will take this ranch. I will strip it down to the foundation and sell every board, and your husband will spend the rest of his life digging out from under debt. Is that really what you want? Clara's hands clenched into fists. What I want is for you to leave us alone. That's not one of your options. Silas moved toward the steps. 1 more day, Clara, then I start foreclosure. After he left, Elias and Clara sat in the cabin, staring at nothing. The clock on the mantel ticked away seconds that felt like hammer's nails into a coffin. I should go with him, Clara said finally. No. Elias, I won't let him destroy everything your father built because of my father's debts. And I won't let him take you like you're some kind of prize to be won. Elias stood, frustration boiling over. There has to be something. Some way. He stopped. His eyes fell on the wooden box on the mantel. His mother's keepsake box, untouched since she died. What? Clara asked, seeing his expression. My mother's jewelry, Elias said slowly. She had jewelry, nothing fancy, but there were some pieces from her mother, from back east, gold and silver. She made me promise to save them for, he swallowed hard, for my wife. Clara stood. Elias, no, those are your mother's things. Things that can be sold. He pulled down the box and opened it. Inside were his mother's treasures, a gold locket, pearl earrings, a silver brooch, a wedding ring set. She'd understand. She'd want us to use them if it meant saving the ranch. It won't be enough, Clara whispered, but there was hope flickering in her eyes. Maybe not, but it's something. Elias closed the box and held it against his chest. And maybe if we combine it with your income, with a promise of steady payments, maybe the bank will see we're serious. They looked at each other across the dim cabin, and something passed between them. An understanding, a commitment, a shared desperation that had transformed into shared determination. 1 more day, Clara said. We have 1 more day to make this work. Then let's make it count. That evening, as darkness settled over Sweetwater Valley like a heavy blanket, Elias sat at the kitchen table with his mother's jewelry box open before him. Each piece caught the lamplight differently. The gold locket spinning tiny reflections across the ceiling, the pearls glowing with a soft inner light, the silver brooch gleaming like captured moonlight. Clara stood behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Tell me about her, she said softly. My mother? Elias picked up the locket, running his thumb over the worn engraving. She was the kind of woman who could make a home out of nothing. We came west with almost nothing, just what we could carry in a wagon, and she turned this cabin into something warm, something real. He opened the locket, revealing a faded photograph of his parents on their wedding day. She wore this every day of her life, said it reminded her why she'd chosen to come to this hard place. Because of love. Because of love, he agreed. She used to say that love was the only thing worth building on, because everything else, money, comfort, security, could be taken away. But love, if you built it right, would hold even when everything else crumbled. Clara's hand tightened on his shoulder. She sounds wise. She was. He closed the locket carefully and set it back in the box. I think she'd be happy knowing these pieces were being used to save the ranch, to save us. Are you sure? Once we sell them. They're just things, Clara. Beautiful things, precious things, but still just things. He looked up at her. You're real. This ranch is real. What we're trying to build together, that's real. My mother would choose the real over the sentimental every time. Before Clara could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his hand reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. Easy, Clara said, peering through the window. I think, yes, it's William Bradford, and he's not alone. Elias opened the door as Bradford dismounted, followed by 3 other men Elias recognized, Thomas Garrett, the Michaels brothers, and Old Man Jensen, all the ranchers Clara had visited that day. Mr. Porter, Mrs. Porter, Bradford said, slightly out of breath. We need to talk. Can we come in? They crowded into the small cabin, these hard men with weathered faces and clothes that smelled of horses and leather. Elias felt a flutter of panic. Had they come to tell Clara her services weren't needed after all? Had Silas gotten to them? We heard, Bradford said without preamble, about Silas Burnham, about what he's trying to do. Elias felt his stomach drop. How did you... Small valley, son. Word travels. Thomas Garrett, who'd never had a kind word for Elias in all the years they'd been neighbors, stepped forward. Burnham's been flashing his money around town, telling anyone who'll listen that he's going to take this ranch and the woman who jilted him. She didn't jilt him, Elias said hotly. She ran from him. There's a difference. We know that, one of the Michaels brothers said. Mrs. Henderson at the general store told us the whole story, about Clara's father, about the debts, about how she came west to escape. The point is, Bradford interrupted, we don't much like the idea of some Kansas bully coming into our valley and pushing decent people around. And we especially don't like the idea of losing the only person in 3 territories who can cure hoof rot. Clara made a small sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Gentlemen, let me finish, Mrs. Porter. Bradford pulled out a leather pouch and set it on the table with a heavy thunk. That's $500, payment in advance for 6 months of your services to the Circle B Ranch. Consider it an investment in keeping you here where you're needed. Before either Elias or Clara could respond, Thomas Garrett stepped forward and placed another, smaller pouch beside Bradford's. $200. 4 months advance payment. My breeding stock is worth more than my pride, and I'll be damned if I let some fancy Kansas rancher steal away the only person who can keep them healthy. Old Man Jensen added his contribution, $150. The Michaels brothers pooled their money and came up with another 100. Within 5 minutes, nearly $1,000 sat on the table, more money than Elias had seen in his entire life. I don't understand, Clara whispered. Why would you do this? Because you walked through a blizzard, Bradford said simply. Because you saved my horses when my regular veterinarian couldn't. Because you're offering hope to operations that were starting to think hope was in short supply. He looked at Elias. And because your husband here is John Porter's son, and John Porter was the kind of man who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. Time we returned the favor to his boy. Elias couldn't speak. His throat had closed up entirely, and he felt tears burning behind his eyes. These men, some friends, some barely acquaintances, one who'd openly wished for his failure, had just handed him salvation. There's one condition, Thomas Garrett said, his gruff voice cutting through the emotion. When you go to the bank tomorrow, you make sure that bastard Burnham knows this money comes from all of us. You make sure he understands that if he wants to push you out, he's pushing against the whole valley, and we push back harder. I will, Elias managed. I swear, I will. After the ranchers left, Elias and Clara stood staring at the money spread across their table. It felt unreal, like something that might vanish if they blinked. We can do this, Clara said, her voice trembling. We have enough now. More than enough. We can pay half the debt, just like Mr. Holmes said. We can save the ranch. Elias pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight, He could feel her heartbeat against his chest. "You saved us," he murmured into her hair. "You came into my life and saved everything." "We saved each other," Clara corrected, pulling back to look at him. "That's what partners do." They spent the rest of the evening planning, figuring out exactly how much they'd pay, how much they'd keep in reserve for supplies and emergencies. When they finally went to bed, Clara in the bedroom, Elias still sleeping by the fire out of propriety despite being married, they both felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: confident about tomorrow. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day where the air was so sharp it hurt to breathe. Elias and Clara dressed in their best clothes and loaded the money carefully into a locked box. They were halfway to the wagon when they heard shouts coming from the direction of the main road. A rider was approaching at a gallop, and as he got closer, Elias recognized him as young Timothy Walsh, the Reverend's son. "Mr. Porter, Mrs. Porter!" Timothy pulled his horse to a sliding stop. "There's been an accident, a wagon overturned on the mountain road, mother and child trapped inside. My father's organizing a rescue, but Mrs. Porter, he said if you were available, they might need someone who knows medicine." Clara didn't hesitate. "Where?" 3 miles up the canyon road. "But, Mr. Porter, the road's bad. Still ice in the shadows. It's dangerous." "We'll manage." Elias was already moving toward the barn. "Clara, get your medicine kit. I'll hitch the wagon." "But the bank," Clara said. "We're supposed to meet Mr. Holmes. This is more important." Elias looked at her steadily. "Someone needs help. That comes first." "Pitan." For a moment, he saw her wrestle with it, the desperate need to secure their future warring with the equally desperate need to help someone in danger. Then her jaw set with determination. "You're right. Let's go." They made the journey as fast as the treacherous road allowed, Timothy leading the way on his horse. When they reached the accident site, Elias's breath caught. The wagon had slid off the road and down a steep embankment, coming to rest at an angle against a boulder. Reverend Walsh and 4 other men from town were trying to figure out how to reach it without causing it to slide further. "Thank God you're here," Reverend Walsh said when he saw them. "There's a woman and a small child inside. We can hear them crying, but the wagon's wedged bad. If we pull wrong, the whole thing could go over the edge, and it's a 30-foot drop below." Elias assessed the situation quickly. The wagon was held in place only by the boulder and a single tree root. One wrong move would send it tumbling. "We need to secure it first," he said. "Ropes anchored to those trees up top, running down to the wagon frame. That way, even if it shifts, it can't fall." "That'll take time," one of the townsmen said. "The woman sounds bad. She might not have time." "Then we work fast." Elias started giving orders, and to his surprise, the men listened. Within minutes, they had ropes secured and were carefully making their way down the embankment. Clara went with them, her medicine kit strapped to her back. Elias tried to tell her to stay safe above, but one look at her face told him that was a waste of breath. Getting to the wagon was terrifying. Every step threatened to dislodge rocks or ice that could start a slide. But they made it, and Elias carefully pried open the wagon door. Inside was a young woman, probably not more than 20, with blood streaming down her face from a gash on her forehead. She clutched a child, a little girl maybe 4 years old, to her chest. The child was crying but appeared uninjured. "Help us," the woman whispered. "Please, my daughter." "We're here," Clara said, climbing into the unstable wagon without hesitation. "We're going to get you both out." The woman had a broken leg, the bone visible through torn fabric, and possible internal injuries. Moving her would be agonizing and dangerous, but leaving her in the wagon while they figured out a safer way to extract her wasn't an option either. The whole structure was groaning ominously, and Elias could see the tree roots starting to tear. "We need to move now," he said to Clara. "This whole thing's about to go." Clara looked at the woman, at the child, and made a decision. "Give me the girl first, then we'll take the mother." It took 15 terrifying minutes. First they passed the crying child up to the men above, who carried her to safety. Then came the harder part, moving the injured mother. Every shift of weight made the wagon creak and slide an inch closer to the edge. Clara worked with steady hands, binding the woman's leg to splint it, packing the head wound to stop the bleeding. "I'm going to give you something for the pain," Clara said, pulling out a small bottle. "It'll make you sleepy, but it'll help." "My baby," the woman mumbled. Is she? She's safe. Now drink this. Once the medicine took effect, they carefully, painstakingly moved the woman out of the wagon. Elias and another man created a makeshift stretcher from branches and rope. They were halfway up the embankment when they heard it, the terrible sound of wood splintering and roots tearing. "Go!" Elias shouted. "Everyone move!" They scrambled up the slope as behind them the wagon broke free and tumbled down the cliff face, smashing into pieces on the rocks below. If they'd been 5 minutes slower, the woman and child would have gone with it. At the top, Clara immediately went to work on the injured woman, cleaning wounds, setting the broken leg properly, checking for signs of internal bleeding. The child clung to her mother, and Reverend Walsh wrapped them both in blankets. "You saved them," he said to Elias and Clara. "If you hadn't come—" "We did come," Elias interrupted. "That's what matters." But as the adrenaline faded and Elias looked at the angle of the sun, his stomach sank. It was past noon. The bank closed at 3. Even if they left right now, they'd barely make it in time. "Clara," he said quietly, "we need to go." She was still bandaging the woman's leg. "I need 10 more minutes. She's stable, but we don't have 10 minutes. If we miss Holmes, if we don't make that payment today, then we don't make it," Clara said, not looking up from her work. "But I won't leave this woman bleeding and broken just to save money." "It's not just money. It's the ranch. Everything. And she's everything to her daughter." Clara tied off the bandage and finally looked at him. "I know what's at stake, Elias. But I also know that some things matter more than property and debt. We do the right thing, and we trust that somehow it'll work out." Elias wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that the real world didn't work like that, that good deeds didn't magically erase debt. But looking at the little girl clinging to her mother, at the woman who would have died without their help, he couldn't force the words out. 10 minutes, he said. Then we ride like hell." Clara nodded and returned to her work. True to her word, she finished in exactly 10 minutes, gave Reverend Walsh detailed instructions for continued care, and then they were in the wagon racing back toward Sweetwater. They pushed Sampson harder than Elias liked, but the old horse seemed to understand the urgency and gave everything he had. Still, when they pulled up in front of the bank, the clock tower was chiming 3. They were too late. Elias felt his heart shatter as he saw Jeremiah Holmes locking the front door. "Wait!" he shouted, jumping from the wagon. "Please, we have the money!" Holmes turned, saw them, and hesitated. For a moment, Elias thought he'd turn them away. Then the banker sighed and unlocked the door. "You're lucky I'm still here doing paperwork," he said, "and that I heard about what you did for the Carson woman and her child. The whole town's talking about it." Inside, Elias opened the locked box and spread the money across Holmes's desk. The banker counted it slowly, his expression revealing nothing. $950, he said finally. "That's more than the half I asked for." "We want to show we're serious," Elias said, "that we can make this work." Holmes leaned back in his chair, studying them both. "Mr. Burnham isn't going to like this. He's been planning all week for foreclosure." "Then Mr. Burnham will be disappointed," Claire said firmly. "We're not giving up our ranch." "I can see that." Holmes pulled out paperwork and started writing. "All right, I'll draft a new payment schedule. You'll still owe the balance plus interest, but this buys you time. 6 months, maybe more if you keep making payments." Elias felt relief wash over him so powerfully he had to sit down. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd actually done it. "However," Holmes added, "I should warn you, Silas Burnham is not a man who takes losing gracefully. He might try something else." "Let him try," Clara said. "We're not alone anymore, and we're not running." They left the bank as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. On the ride back to the ranch, Elias reached over and took Clara's hand. "You were right," he said, "about doing the right thing first. If we'd left that woman to die just to save the ranch, we wouldn't have been able to live with ourselves," Clara finished. "And a ranch we couldn't live with ourselves in isn't worth saving." When they reached home, they found Silas Burnham waiting on the porch again. But this time his expression was different, no longer confident and mocking, but tight with barely controlled anger. "I heard," he said without preamble. "You made the payment." "We did," Elias confirmed. "It doesn't matter. I'll find another way." "You can't keep me from what's mine, Clara." I was never yours, Clara said, her voice steady and strong. I never will be. And if you continue to harass us, I'll go to every ranch in this valley and tell them exactly what kind of man you are. How you prey on desperate people, use their father's debts to try to force them into unwanted marriages. How you followed me across 3 territories because you can't stand that someone said no to you. Silas's face went red. And you think these frontier peasants will care? These peasants are the reason we made that payment, Elias interrupted. They advanced us money because they believe in Clara's work. They trust her. And they sure as hell don't trust a man like you who shows up throwing his weight around. You'll regret this, Silas hissed. Both of you. I have resources you can't imagine. I can make your lives— Get off my property, Elias said quietly. Now, before I throw you off. For a moment, Silas looked like he might argue. Then he seemed to remember the 2 ranch hands Elias could see weren't with him this time, seemed to calculate his chances alone against a man who had nothing left to lose, and thought better of it. This isn't over, he said, but he was already backing toward his horse. Yes, Clara said. It is. Go home, Silas. Find someone who actually wants you, because I never did, and I never will. They watched him ride away, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the evening. When they could no longer see him, Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Do you think he'll really leave us alone? Clara asked. I don't know, but I know we'll face whatever comes together. That night, they celebrated quietly, just the 2 of them. A simple dinner of salt pork and beans, coffee that was actually fresh for once. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like a feast after the fear of the past days. I keep thinking about that woman, Clara said. Mrs. Carson, the Reverend called her. Her husband died in the mines last month. She was trying to reach her sister's place before winter got too bad. Will she be all right? If she rests and follows my instructions, the leg will heal, though she'll probably limp. But she's alive, and her daughter still has a mother. That counts for something. It counts for everything. Elias reached across the table and took both her hands. Clara, I want you to know what you did today, choosing to help her even when it meant risking the ranch. That's the kind of person my father would have been proud to call family. The kind my mother would have loved. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. That might be the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me. It's true. He stood and pulled her to her feet, into his arms. I know we married fast, out of desperation and necessity, but I want you to know I'm grateful every day that you knocked on my door. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope, he said simply. The ability to believe tomorrow might be better than today. Clara rose on her toes and kissed him, gentle and sweet. Then let's make sure tomorrow is better, and the day after that. Let's build something worth hoping for. They stood there in their small cabin, 2 people who'd been strangers 3 weeks ago, now bound together by shared struggle and growing affection. Outside, the Wyoming winter continued its assault, but inside, something warm and precious was taking root. Something that felt an awful lot like the beginning of love. The next weeks passed in a blur of hard work. Clara made her rounds to the various ranches, treating sick animals and teaching remedies. Word of her skills spread, and soon she was getting calls from as far as 40 miles away. Elias worked on the ranch, repairing fences, caring for the cattle that were slowly regaining their health, making plans for spring. And every evening they came together in the cabin and shared their days over dinner. Slowly, carefully, they were learning each other, Clara's habit of singing while she worked, Elias's tendency to brood quietly when worried, the way they both startled at unexpected sounds, legacy of their respective traumas. 1 month after they'd made the first payment to the bank, Reverend Walsh arrived at the ranch with news. Mrs. Carson wants to see you, he told Clara. She and her daughter, they've been staying with us while she recovers, and she asked if you'd visit. Clara and Elias rode to town together. They found Mrs. Carson sitting in the Reverend's parlor, her leg in a splint but her color good. Her daughter, little Emma, played with a rag doll nearby. Mrs. Porter, Mrs. Carson said, struggling to stand. Please, don't get up. Clara moved to sit beside her. How are you feeling? Better every day, thanks to you. Mrs. Carson took Clara's hand. The Reverend told me what you did, how you climbed into that wagon even though it could have fallen at any moment, how you delayed going to the bank to make sure I was stable, how that delay almost cost you your ranch. We made it in time, Clara said gently. That's what matters. But you didn't know you would. You chose to help me anyway. Mrs. Carson's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to thank you. And to tell you that when I'm healed, if you ever need help with the house, the cooking, anything, I'll work for you for free, to pay back what you did. That's not necessary. It is to me. Mrs. Carson squeezed her hand. You gave my daughter her mother back. I can never truly repay that, but I can try. On the ride home, Elias glanced at Clara. You're thinking something. Mrs. Carson needs work, Clara said slowly. And we could use help around the ranch, someone to manage the house while we're both working outside. What if we hired her? Offered her and Emma a place to stay in exchange for helping with cooking and basic household work. We can barely afford to feed ourselves, but we can afford it better than we could a month ago. And Clara's income is steady now. She turned to face him. Elias, that woman has nowhere to go. Her husband's dead, she has a child to support, and she can't do hard physical labor with that leg. We could help her, and she could help us. He thought about it, about how much easier things would be with someone to manage the house, to have dinner ready when they came in, exhausted from work, about how the cabin that had been so lonely for so long was slowly filling with life. All right, he said, let's talk to her, see if she's willing. 2 days later, Mrs. Carson and Emma moved into the small room off the kitchen that had once been Elias's mother's sewing room. The cabin suddenly felt full, almost crowded, but it was the good kind of full, the kind that came with Emma's laughter and Mrs. Carson's quiet singing as she cooked, with the smell of fresh bread and the sight of Clara teaching the little girl to identify medicinal herbs. The ranch was becoming something Elias hadn't expected, not just a working operation, but a community. A place where people helped each other, where broken things found purpose, where hope was tended like a precious crop. And in the middle of it all was Clara, his wife, his partner, the woman who'd walked through a blizzard and brought spring with her. Spring came to Sweetwater Valley like a promise kept. The snow melted from the high peaks, filling the streams with rushing water that sang day and night. The meadows turned green almost overnight, and the cattle that had survived the brutal winter grew sleek and healthy on the new grass. The ranch that had been dying 6 months ago was now, impossibly, beginning to thrive. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn one April morning, watching Elias work with the new calves. They'd had a good calving season, 18 healthy births, only 2 losses. The herd was growing again, slowly rebuilding what had been lost. Mrs. Porter, Mrs. Carson called from the cabin, there's someone here to see you. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and headed back, wondering which rancher had come calling this time. Her reputation had spread so far that she now had more work than she could handle, even with Elias helping when his ranch duties allowed. But it wasn't a rancher waiting in the yard. It was a woman Clara didn't recognize, well-dressed, perhaps 40, with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority. Beside her stood a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, holding a leather satchel. Mrs. Whitlock Porter? The woman asked. Just Mrs. Porter now, Clara said, extending her hand. How can I help you? My name is Dr. Margaret Brennan, the woman said, shaking Clara's hand firmly. I'm a veterinary surgeon from Denver, and this is my apprentice, David Walsh. We've been hearing remarkable stories about your work with livestock diseases, and we've come to see if even half of what we've heard is true. Clara felt heat rise to her face. I'm not a surgeon, Dr. Brennan. I just know some old remedies. Old remedies that have saved animals when modern medicine failed, Dr. Brennan interrupted gently. William Bradford wrote to me personally about his horses. He described your diagnosis of lye poisoning and your treatment in detail. It was textbook perfect, Mrs. Porter, except you've apparently never read a textbook. My grandfather taught me. Then your grandfather must have been an extraordinary teacher. Dr. Brennan gestured to her apprentice, who opened the satchel and pulled out a thick book. I've written a medical text on livestock diseases for the frontier territories. I'm here because I'd like to include your remedies, properly documented and credited to you, of course. And I'd like to offer you an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? To train properly as a veterinary practitioner. I run a small school in Denver, 6 students at a time, intensive training. It's a new field for women, But the frontier needs skilled practitioners, and I believe you have an innate gift that proper training could enhance. Clara stared at her, speechless. The idea of formal training, of being a real doctor for animals, it was beyond anything she'd imagined. I can't leave, she said finally. My husband needs me here. The ranch would be 3 months, Dr. Brennan said. The summer term. And I wouldn't expect you to pay tuition. In fact, I'd pay you a small stipend in exchange for documenting your traditional remedies for my research. 3 months, Claire repeated, her mind spinning. Elias appeared behind her, having heard the last part of the conversation. What's this about 3 months? Dr. Brennan explained her offer again while Elias listened with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. When the doctor finished, he was quiet for a long moment. That's a remarkable opportunity, he said finally. Elias, I can't leave you for 3 months, Clara protested. Not with the ranch just starting to recover. You need— What I need, Elias interrupted gently, is for my wife to have every chance to become everything she's capable of being. Clara, you've been offered training that could change your life, change our lives. How can I possibly stand in the way of that? But the money I bring in from the ranches, we'll manage. We have enough put aside now. The herd's healthy, and Mrs. Carson can help with the work. He took her hands. You saved this ranch, Clara. You saved me. The least I can do is support you in becoming even better at what you already do brilliantly. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Are you sure? I'm sure. He squeezed her hands. Go to Denver, learn everything you can, and then come back and build the best veterinary practice this territory has ever seen. Dr. Brennan smiled. Then it's settled. The term starts in 2 weeks. I'll send details to the Sweetwater General Store. She paused. Mrs. Porter, I should mention there will be resistance. Many people don't believe women belong in medicine, even veterinary medicine. You'll face challenges. I walked 5 miles through a blizzard to get here, Clara said, her voice steady. I think I can handle some closed minds. After Dr. Brennan left, Clara and Elias stood together in the yard, both trying to process what had just happened. 3 months is a long time, Clara said quietly. It is. But we survived longer apart before we met. Elias pulled her close. And when you come back, we'll have the rest of our lives together. You're really not angry or resentful? How could I be? Clara, watching you work, seeing how you bring life and health wherever you go, that's been one of the greatest joys of our marriage. Why would I want to limit that? He kissed her forehead. Go be extraordinary. I'll be here when you get back. The 2 weeks before Clara left passed in a whirlwind of preparation. She made arrangements with her regular clients, taught Elias and Mrs. Carson her most important remedies, and packed her small trunk with the few belongings she'd need. The night before she was to leave, they lay together in the bedroom that had finally become theirs, properly theirs, as husband and wife in truth as well as in law. The transition had been gradual, tentative, 2 wounded people learning to trust and love again. But what they'd built was real and strong and worth every moment of uncertainty. I'm scared, Clara admitted in the darkness. Not of the training, but of leaving you, of being apart. I'm scared too, Elias confessed. But I'm also proud. So damn proud I can barely stand it. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll keep hoping. Keep believing things can get better. Don't slide back into that dark place where I found you. He pulled her closer. I promise. And you promise me you'll come back. That Denver won't steal you away from this little Wyoming ranch. I promise. This is home now. You're home. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, storing up warmth against the separation to come. Clara left on the morning stage, and Elias stood watching until the coach disappeared over the horizon. Then he turned back to the ranch and threw himself into work, trying to fill the sudden emptiness with activity. The first week was the hardest. He kept turning to tell Clara something, only to remember she wasn't there. The cabin felt too quiet without her singing. The work felt heavier without her help. But letters came. Clara wrote nearly every day, long, detailed letters about her classes, her fellow students, the fascinating things she was learning. And Elias wrote back, telling her about the ranch, about little Emma's growth. About the new foal that had been born with legs so long it looked like it was walking on stilts. Gradually, the separation became manageable. Not easy, but bearable. And then, 6 weeks into Clara's absence, everything nearly fell apart. Elias was in town picking up supplies when he saw the poster in the general store window. It was a legal notice, and his name was prominently featured, Notice of Lien, Porter Ranch, Outstanding Debt Collection. His stomach dropped. He burst into the store where Mrs. Henderson looked up with sympathetic eyes. "I'm so sorry, Elias," she said. "That went up this morning, that Kansas man, Burnham, he's claiming you still owe money on Clara's father's debt. Says the payment you made only covered part of what's owed." "That's impossible. We paid what Holmes said we owed." "I know, dear, but Burnham's brought in lawyers. They're saying there was interest that wasn't calculated, fees that weren't disclosed. I don't understand all the legal talk, but it doesn't sound good." Elias rode straight to the bank. Jeremiah Holmes met him with genuine distress on his face. "I'm sorry, Elias. Burnham found a loophole. The original promissory note Clara's father signed included a clause about compounding interest that wasn't properly disclosed when I drew up your payment plan. Technically, you still owe nearly $600. $600? I don't have $600. "I know, and Burnham knows it too. He's filed for immediate foreclosure. You have 30 days to pay the full amount or the ranch goes to auction." Holmes looked miserable. "I tried to fight it, but he's got Denver lawyers, good ones. Unless you can come up with the money." Elias rode home in a daze. After everything, after Clara's work, after the community support, after months of progress, they were going to lose it all anyway, and Clara wasn't even here to face it with him. That night, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote her the hardest letter of his life. He tried to keep it factual, tried not to let his devastation bleed through every word, but he knew she'd read between the lines. Mrs. Carson found him there at dawn, his head on his arms, the letter still unsealed beside him. "Mr. Porter," she said softly, "are you all right?" He told her everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does Clara know?" "I wrote to her. But by the time the letter reaches Denver and she can respond, it'll be too late." "Then you need to go to her." "What?" "Go to Denver. Tell her in person. Figure out together what to do." Mrs. Carson's voice was firm. "Mr. Porter, I've seen you two together. You're stronger together than apart. Don't face this alone just because she's away." "I can't leave the ranch. I can manage for a few days. Emma and I will take care of the animals. You go to your wife." 2 days later, Elias stood outside the Denver Veterinary College, feeling completely out of place in his worn ranch clothes among the city buildings and well-dressed people. He'd sent a telegram ahead, and Clara was waiting for him on the steps. She took one look at his face and knew. "It's bad, isn't it?" "It's bad." They found a quiet park nearby, and Elias explained everything. Clara listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each detail. $600, she said when he finished. "And we have 30 days. 27 now. Clara, I don't see how—" "I do." She stood abruptly. "Come with me." She led him back to the college, through the halls to Dr. Brennan's office. The doctor looked up in surprise when they entered. "Mrs. Porter, Mr. Porter, what's wrong?" Clara explained the situation quickly, efficiently. When she finished, Dr. Brennan sat back in her chair, thinking. "You need $600 in less than a month," she said finally. "That's a considerable sum." "I know, Dr. Brennan, I wouldn't ask, but I'm out of options. If there's any way you could advance me payment for documenting my remedies—" "I can't," Dr. Brennan said, and Clara's face fell. "But I might know someone who can help. Give me 2 days." Those 2 days felt like 2 years. Clara attended her classes mechanically, her mind constantly on the ranch and the ticking clock. Elias stayed in a cheap boarding house, feeling useless and lost in the unfamiliar city. On the evening of the second day, Dr. Brennan summoned them both back to her office. With her was an older gentleman with kind eyes and expensive clothes. "This is Richard Harrington," Dr. Brennan said. "He's a wealthy investor and philanthropist, and more importantly, he's my uncle. I've told him your situation." "Mrs. Porter," Harrington said, shaking Clara's hand, "my niece tells me you're one of the most talented natural veterinarians she's encountered. She also tells me you've been documenting traditional remedies that could save countless animals across the frontier. I've been trying, sir, but I'd like to invest in your future. Harrington interrupted gently. I'll pay the $600 you need. In exchange, I'd like the exclusive rights to publish and distribute a book of your remedies, with your name as the author, and you'll receive royalties from sales. Clara stared at him. A book? My remedies? Dr. Brennan has shown me your documentation. It's thorough, practical, and desperately needed. Frontier ranchers can't always access trained veterinarians, but they could use a comprehensive guide to traditional treatments. He pulled out a contract. I've had my lawyer draw this up. You get your money now. I get publishing rights. We both profit if the book sells, which I believe it will. Elias looked at Clara, saw the wonder and disbelief in her face. Is this real? She whispered. It's real, Dr. Brennan confirmed. Richard has published 12 medical texts. He knows what he's doing. Clara reached for Elias's hand. What do you think? I think, Elias said slowly, that you walked through a blizzard 6 months ago, and you've been performing miracles ever since. Why should this be any different? Clara signed the contract with shaking hands. Harrington provided a bank draft for $600, which Elias tucked carefully into his coat pocket like the precious miracle it was. One more thing, Harrington added as they were leaving. Dr. Brennan tells me you're planning to return to your ranch after completing this term. Have you considered staying in Denver? Opening a practice here? The city desperately needs skilled veterinarians. Clara didn't hesitate. Thank you, sir, but no. My home is in Sweetwater Valley. My work is there. Harrington smiled. I thought you might say that. It speaks well of you, Mrs. Porter. The frontier is lucky to have you. Elias took the first stage back to Sweetwater, the bank draft burning a hole in his pocket. He walked straight to Jeremiah Holmes' office and slapped the draft on the desk. $600, he said. Paid in full. Holmes stared at the draft like it might disappear. How did you? My wife, Elias said simply. She's extraordinary. That she is. Holmes began processing the paperwork. Elias, I need you to understand. This should clear everything. I've triple-checked the numbers this time. Once this is paid, you'll own the ranch free and clear, except for standard operating costs. Free and clear, Elias repeated, barely able to process the words. Free and clear. You've done it. You've saved your father's ranch. Elias rode home in a daze. When he reached the ranch, he dismounted and just stood there, looking at the land that had nearly killed him with its demands, that had brought him to his knees with its needs, the land that Clara had helped him save. Mr. Porter? Mrs. Carson came out of the cabin. Did it work? Were you able to pay? We paid. It's over. We're free. Mrs. Carson's face broke into a huge smile. Then we need to celebrate. I'll make something special for dinner. This calls for a feast. That evening, sitting at the table with Mrs. Carson and little Emma, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real, deep peace. The kind that came not from having no problems, but from knowing that whatever problems came, they could be faced and overcome. The rest of Clara's training passed quickly. Elias marked off each day on the calendar, counting down to her return. When the day finally came, he rode to meet the stage, arriving an hour early because he couldn't stand to wait at home. When the coach pulled in and Clara stepped down, his breath caught. She looked different, more confident, more polished. For a moment, he worried that Denver had changed her, had made her into someone who wouldn't be satisfied with ranch life anymore. Then she saw him, and her face lit up with such joy that his fears evaporated. She ran to him, and he caught her up in his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. I missed you, she said against his neck. God, I missed you so much. I missed you too, every single day. They held each other in the middle of the dusty street, not caring who saw, just grateful to be together again. On the ride back to the ranch, Clara told him about the final weeks of her training, about the certificate she'd earned, about all the new techniques she'd learned. But mostly, she talked about how much she'd looked forward to coming home. Denver is impressive, she said, but it's not home. Home is that little cabin with the leaky roof. Home is you. When they crested the final hill
and the ranch came into view, Clara gasped. In her absence, Elias had been busy. The barn had a new roof, the fences had all been repaired, the cabin had fresh paint, and in the meadow beyond the cattle grazed, nearly 50 head now, healthy and growing. "You've been working," she said. "Had to do something to fill the time. Plus, I wanted you to come home to something worth coming home to." Clara turned to him with tears in her eyes. "Elias, you are what's worth coming home to. The rest is just buildings." That night, they lay in their bed and talked for hours, catching up on everything letters couldn't convey. Finally, as they were drifting towards sleep, Elias said, "Richard Harrington sent a telegram. Your book is ready for publication. He wants to call it Whitlock's Remedies, Traditional Treatments for Frontier Livestock." "Whitlock's Remedies," Clara repeated, testing the words. "I like it, though it should probably be Porter's Remedies now." "No," Elias said firmly. "Whitlock is the name your grandfather taught you under. It's the name that represents your gift. Keep it for the book. Keep it for your work. You can be Clara Whitlock Porter, the woman who walks between both worlds." She kissed him, soft and grateful. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "We found each other, and I think maybe that's how grace works. It shows up when you least expect it, in forms you don't recognize, and it saves you whether you think you deserve saving or not." The months that followed brought a steady rhythm of work and growth. Clara's book was published and became an unexpected success, selling to ranchers across the Western Territories. Royalties began arriving, not enough to make them rich, but enough to provide real security. Her veterinary practice flourished. She built a small clinic behind the barn, and ranchers came from as far as 100 miles away seeking her help. David Walsh, Dr. Brennan's former apprentice, came west to work with her, and together they treated everything from milk fever to rattlesnake bites. The ranch continued to recover and expand. Elias hired 2 ranch hands, young men from town who needed work, and began breeding horses alongside the cattle. The Porter Ranch became known not just as a successful operation, but as a place where second chances were given freely. Mrs. Carson and Emma stayed, becoming permanent parts of the household. Emma grew into a bright, curious child who followed Clara everywhere, learning about herbs and animals. Mrs. Carson managed the house with quiet efficiency and started teaching reading to the ranch hands' children in the evenings. By the time the first anniversary of Clara's arrival rolled around, the ranch was unrecognizable from the dying operation Elias had been ready to abandon. On Christmas Eve, 1 year after Clara had knocked on his door, they hosted a gathering for the community that had saved them. The barn, the same barn where Clara had first worked to save Elias's cattle, had been transformed into a meeting hall for the evening. Lanterns hung from the rafters. Tables groaned under the weight of contributed food. The whole valley seemed to have turned out. William Bradford stood and raised his glass. "To Clara and Elias Porter," he said, "for showing us all what determination and grace can accomplish." "To the Porters!" the crowd echoed. Later, as the evening wound down and people began to drift home, Reverend Walsh approached them. "I have something for you both," he said, pulling out a small wooden cross. "I carved this from the wood of that tree root that held Mrs. Carson's wagon. I thought you should have it, a reminder that sometimes what saves us is smaller than we think, but stronger than we know." Elias took the cross, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "Thank you, Reverend." "Thank you both. You've reminded this valley what faith looks like in action." After everyone had gone, Clara and Elias stood alone in the barn, looking at the empty tables and guttering lanterns. "1 year ago," Clara said softly, "I was walking through a blizzard, terrified and half frozen, with no idea what I'd find at the end of my journey. And now I'm home. Really, truly home for the first time in my life." She leaned against him. "You asked me once why I came. I told you I came for a chance. But Elias, you gave me so much more than a chance. You gave me a place to belong, a purpose, a family. You gave me those things too." He wrapped his arms around her. "You weren't my mail-order bride, Clara. You were God's answer to a prayer I'd stopped believing he heard. You were grace arriving in a storm." "Then I guess we're both miracles," she said. "Two broken people who found a way to make something whole." They stood there as the lanterns flickered out one by one, until only the moonlight remained,
spilling through the barn windows and painting everything silver. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle this time, not the killer blizzard of a year ago, but a soft benediction on the land they'd fought so hard to save. The ranch would face challenges again. There would be hard years and setbacks, times when the old fears came creeping back. But they would face those times together, armed with the knowledge that they'd already survived the worst and emerged stronger. As they walked back to the cabin through the falling snow, Clara began to sing, the same hymn she'd sung in this barn a year ago when she'd first started saving his dying cattle. Her voice rose clear and sweet into the winter night, and Elias joined in, their voices blending and carrying across the valley. In the cabin, Mrs. Carson had left the fire burning and lamps glowing. Emma was asleep in her small room. Everything was warm and welcoming and alive. Clara hung the wooden cross Reverend Walsh had given them beside the door, a reminder of salvation and second chances, of grace arriving when least expected. "Merry Christmas, Elias Porter," she said, taking his hands. "Merry Christmas, Clara Whitlock Porter," he replied. "My wife, my partner, my answered prayer." They stood together in the doorway, looking out at the snow-covered ranch that had nearly died but now thrived. The ranch that had become more than just land and buildings. It had become a haven for broken things learning to be whole again, for lost souls finding their way home. In the distance, they could see lights from other ranches in the valley, each one a reminder that they were part of something larger than themselves. A community built on mutual support and shared struggle. A place where people looked out for each other, where a woman could walk through a blizzard and find not just shelter, but salvation. The ranch had a new name now. The sign Elias had carved and mounted at the entrance read, "Whitlock Haven," honoring both Clara's healing work and the refuge they'd built together. It was a name that meant something to everyone who saw it, a promise of help for those who needed it, a testament to the power of not giving up, a declaration that hope could take root even in the hardest soil. As they closed the door against the winter cold and turned to face their warm, living home, Elias pulled Clara close one more time. "I love you," he said, words that had taken months to say but now came easily. "I love the life we're building. I love who I am when I'm with you." "I love you too," Clara replied, "and I love that we chose each other, not just once in desperation, but every day since. That's the real miracle, I think. Not that we survived, but that we chose to keep surviving together." They stood there in the warmth and light of their home. Two people who'd been strangers a year ago, now bound together by love and shared purpose, and the knowledge that they'd faced the worst life could throw at them and come through it transformed. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the world in white. But inside Whitlock Haven, in the cabin on the ranch that should have died but lived, there was only warmth and light, and the quiet joy of answered prayers and second chances and grace that arrived in storms and changed everything. The story of the mail-order bride who walked through a blizzard and saved a dying ranch would be told and retold in Sweetwater Valley for generations. It would become legend, embellished, romanticized, passed down as a testament to determination and faith and love. But for Clara and Elias, living it was better than any legend. Every morning they woke up together was a gift. Every animal Clara healed was a reminder of her purpose. Every improvement to the ranch was a victory over the darkness that had nearly claimed them both. They would have children eventually, 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl, all of whom would grow up hearing the story of how their parents met. They would prosper and struggle, know joy and sorrow, build and rebuild, over decades of shared life. But on this Christmas Eve, 1 year after a desperate woman knocked on a dying man's door, they were simply 2 people grateful to have found each other, grateful to have been given a second chance, grateful that sometimes, when hope seems lost and the storm is at its worst, grace arrives in the most unexpected forms and changes everything. Whitlock Haven would stand for over 100 years, passed down through generations, always remembered as the place where 2 broken people made each other whole, where a woman's hidden talent saved more than just a struggling ranch. It saved a man's soul and built a legacy of healing that would touch thousands of lives. But that night, in the warmth of their cabin, with the snow falling gently outside and the fire burning bright within, Clara and Elias Porter simply held each other close and gave thanks for the journey that had brought them together. They had walked through storms, literal and figurative, and emerged on the other side with something rare and precious, a love built on shared struggle, a partnership forged in adversity, and a home that welcomed the broken and helped them become whole. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything they'd been searching for without knowing what they sought. And as they finally headed to bed that Christmas Eve, exhausted but content, Clara paused at the door to look back at the small wooden cross hanging beside it, the cross carved from the tree root that had saved a life, given to them by a grateful reverend. "Do you believe in miracles now?" she asked Elias softly. He looked at her, his wife, his partner, the woman who'd brought light back into his darkness, and smiled. "I married one," he said. "How could I not believe?" And in Whitlock Haven, on the ranch that love rebuilt, two souls who'd been lost found their way home at last. The end.